Hello guys, this is a Unit 2 functional anatomy video looking at topics of muscular system, and we are looking at E1 muscle types. Now, muscles are made up of lots of different individual fibres, and we have to learn about the three different kinds of skeletal muscle fibres. You may know some from school, you may not, but let's look at them. The three that we need to know about are type 1, type 2A, and type 2X. So we're looking at this section of information here. They have different names, slow, intermediate, fast, but we're going to try and learn the type 1, type 2A, type 2X names. So as athletes, we take part in all sorts of different events. We need to have all sorts of different skills, and they all demand different things of our muscles. So somebody like Jess Ennis throwing the javelin could be a shot put, could be a long jump. This type of event requires the muscles to generate huge forces instantaneously, so that obviously the object, whether that's your body or the javelin in this case, can be propelled as far as possible. And one of our types of muscle fibres is brilliant at doing that. The others not so much. Or you could be a 100-metre or 200-metre sprinter, like Mr. Bolt here. Again, you need not just one maximal contraction, like the javelin, but you need repeated, very high intensity, very high force contraction to propel him down the track as fast as possible. Again, that would be the same muscle fibre, is great at propelling him along the track. Then we've got the sort of middle distance event. So this is an 800-metre athlete Kelly Holmes, who was a gold medalist in she did brilliantly in a couple of Olympics for us. So this event goes on for a bit longer than a 200-metre, 100-metre, obviously, but it is a fairly maximal. These athletes actually go at quite a pace. It's not as fast as the short distance sprinter would be, of course, but they've got to have muscle fibres that can generate fairly high forces for quite a bit longer, for a more extended period. And I would call that speed endurance. 100 metres is speed, flat out, as fast as you can go. This is more speed endurance, going as fast as you can, but having to endure for a greater distance or a longer time. Then we've got our typical endurance athlete. So we need fibres that can contract repeatedly over an hour, 2 hours, 3 hours, 4 hours, depending on how long your event takes. Could be a marathon. In this case, it's the Brownlee brothers taking part in a triathlon. So their muscle fibres, or the muscle fibres they use to do this sort of event, are required to sustain contractions over a long period of time, high duration. But also, some athletes need to do different sorts of things. So something like the heptathlon, 7 different events, or the decathlon for men, 10 different events. We've got those immediate maximal single contractions. We've got that slightly longer sprint. We've got the 800 metres speed endurance. So Jess Ennis's muscle fibres or muscles need to be able to do different sorts of work to respond to these different demands. And again, many of us are games players. And within the games that we play, whether it's netball, football, hockey, basketball, rugby, again, there are different aspects of our sport that need our muscles to work in different ways. You might have to jump to head of the ball. You might want to strike the ball powerfully. You definitely need to endure the whole game and keep going for the whole game, 90 minutes or more. There might be an extended, intense bit of play, especially if you're a midfielder where you've got to run up and down the pitch multiple times. So it's a sort of a higher intensity but speed endurance type situation. So the principle here is we've got 3 types of muscle fibres, and some events require one of those fibres to do their thing. Some events, like the games that we play, require our muscle fibres to work at different times for different aspects of the game. So let's have a look at the 3 types of muscle fibre. First of all, let's look at our endurance fibres. Now, we need to understand aspects of how they're built, their structure, and how that enables them to work the way they do, and how that enables our athletes to sustain muscle contractions for a long duration or a high duration event. So how are the slow twitch or type 1 fibres structured to enable them to endure events? Well, they've got quite a small motor neuron going to the muscle fibres to innervate them. The motor units, the type 1 motor units, are actually fairly small also, maybe low numbers like 10 fibres being recruited by one motor neuron, maybe more, but it could be they're relatively small in size. The muscle fibres themselves are quite small in diameter, so they're quite thin if you like. They only work by energy that's been made aerobically. So you've got a couple of different energy systems, 3 different energy systems that make energy for your muscles to contract. Our endurance type 1 fibres use aerobic energy only. They don't work anaerobically, they just use the aerobic energy system, which means that they need loads of aerobic enzymes in them so they can do this. They can break down fuel and make energy aerobically. So the fuel that they use is fat, so they have reasonably high stores of triglyceride, which is the stored form of fat. They've got some glycogen. Glycogen is essential. They're the main 2 fuels. And they've got very little phosphocreatine. Now, you may not know a lot about that at the moment. That's perhaps something that comes out in the physiology unit a bit more. But phosphocreatine is used for quick energy. Now, these muscle fibres don't use quick energy. They use slow and steady and ongoing energy. So fat and glycogen are the 2 most important fuels used by these fibres. But in order to work aerobically and break down those fuels, these fibres need to have access to a good supply of oxygen. And therefore, what they have is lots of capillaries around them to deliver the oxygen, lots of myoglobin, which stores oxygen in the muscles. Myo means muscles, and we know hemoglobin carries oxygen in the blood. Myoglobin stores oxygen in the muscles. And they also have lots of mitochondria to use that oxygen to make aerobic energy. Now, because they've got myoglobin and capillaries, it makes these fibres look red in colour. So that's their structure. They've got a small, slow motor neuron. The motor units are quite small. The fibres themselves are quite small in diameter. And if they're small in diameter, that means they can't generate big forces. They work aerobically. And to do that, they need the aerobic fuels, fat and glycogen. They need the aerobic enzymes to break that fuel down, and they need oxygen availability. So they need capillaries, myoglobin, mitochondria, which makes them look red in colour. When they're working, given that their other name is slow twitch fibres, it makes sense that they actually have quite a slow contraction speed. So the endurance athletes aren't about power, they're about slow and steady. So they have a slow contraction speed. They have the relatively lowest force of production. So when they do contract, they don't generate big forces because they're so small. But they do have the highest fatigue resistance. And what that means is they don't get tired very easily. They can keep going for ages. So we can summarize that by saying that type 1 fibres are low intensity, not big forces, high duration, keep going for ages, events. They have low anaerobic capacity, but they have really high aerobic capacity. And our endurance athletes are aerobic athletes. And we've already said that these events, endurance events, tend to be long distance things, triathlons, distance swimming or cycling, and something like a steeplechase in athletics. So we've looked at our slow twitch, type 1 endurance, keep going for ages, don't generate much force fibres. Let's look at the other end of the spectrum, our type 2X fibres. These fibres generate huge forces to very, very quickly for explosive contractions. So again, structurally, the difference is pretty obvious. It's kind of the opposite. So there are large motor neurons taking an action potential, an impulse to these muscle fibres to make them contract. And the fact that the motor neurons are large means they can be very fast. The size of the motor unit, so each nerve probably stimulates hundreds of type 2X fibres, so 800, it could be up to 800 or more. So when an impulse does come down that neuron and it innervates those motor units, all of those fibres will contract, which, as you might imagine, generates massive forces. The fibres themselves, so the muscle fibres, type 2X muscle fibres, are large, thick muscle fibres. If you compare the look of a sprinter who tends to have quite bulky muscles to that of an endurance athlete who tends to be more slender, they do have muscles, but they're not as big and bulky. This is why, because all of their muscle fibres are, well, the majority of their muscle fibres are type 2X and are thicker. They get bulkier muscles. Now, again, in contrast, type 2X fibres only work anaerobically. They do not use oxygen. Oxygen's a slow thing to use. We need fast, quick energy. So they only work anaerobically, and they work using the ATP-PC and lactate energy systems. Again, that's a bit more the physiology unit, but if you can hold on to that, that's great. It means they break down fuel without the use of oxygen. Obviously, to work anaerobically, they need loads of anaerobic enzymes, but the most important fuels for these fibres are phosphocreatine. It's a very quick fuel, okay? It splits and you've got energy. And lots of glycogen, carbohydrate. Glycogen is the stored form of carbohydrate. They don't use fat stores. Fat is a slow energy release fuel. So unlike type 1 fibres, we've got lots of carbohydrate, lots of glycogen, lots of phosphocreatine, and not very much fat. Because they don't use oxygen, obviously, there's hardly any capillaries around these fibres. They have very little myoglobin and mitochondria because those are all associated with aerobic respiration, and these don't do that. Because they don't have those things, they look white under a microscope. So how do they work? They've got those structural characteristics. How do they work then? Well, they are the fastest to contract. We know that because these are great for our fast, powerful contractions. Fastest contraction speed, highest force production. How, unfortunately though, because of those things and because of the way they work anaerobically, they have the lowest fatigue resistance, and that means they get tired quite quickly. So you can't sprint endlessly for hours, can you? You can sprint for a relatively short period of time. And because of that, we would say that these are really important for and are used in the highest intensity, maximal events, but the lowest duration, the shortest events, a throw, a jump, a short sprint. They're the highest anaerobic, they have the highest anaerobic and lowest aerobic capacity. So they're great anaerobically and don't work aerobically. And for that reason, they're great for explosive, maximal events, your speed, your power, your throws, your jumps, your swim sprints, or your, short sprints. So it's possible you may have heard of your type 1 and your type 2X already, your slow twitch or fast twitch from school. You may or may not have heard of type 2A fibres. Now, these are also called intermediate fibres. So there's a few things to know. First of all, you can see by their name, they are type 2. So they are mainly a type 2 anaerobic fast twitch kind of fibre. However, the A bit means that they're also called an intermediate fibre, which means they also have some capacity to work aerobically as well. So these are like an in-between fibre. They mainly work for power and anaerobic purposes, but they can endure a bit longer than the type 2X fibres, which get tired really quickly. Not as much as type 1, which are purely designed for endurance. These are in-betweeners. So let's have a look at structure. This would be your 800 metres, maybe your 1500 metres, your extended sprinting in a football match. So they still have a large motor neuron. They've got a moderate size motor unit. They've got a moderate size diameter, so they're not quite as big as your type 2X fibres. They're certainly bigger than type 1. They can work using anaerobic and anaerobic energy systems. Okay, so they can work aerobically and anaerobically. And logically, then, they need both of those kinds of enzymes. They still, because they're slightly more type 2, they'd still have higher amounts of the glycogen, carbohydrate stores, or the phosphocreatine stores than they do fat. But they will have some, maybe moderate levels of capillaries, myoglobin, and mitochondria. in order to enable them to work aerobically, you've got to have oxygen. So they've got to have some of those delivering and storing and using the oxygen. And because they're kind of in between the other two, these are perhaps pinkish looking under a microscope. And as you can imagine, functionally, they're fairly fast contraction speed, probably not as fast as type 2X, maybe moderate force production, moderate fatigue resistance. They don't fatigue as much as type 2X, they fatigue more than type 1, so it's in the middle. So these guys are for moderate intensity. These would be recruited to work for you if you were doing moderate intensity and duration events. So things that needed you to work fairly hard, but for a fairly long time. They have high anaerobic and moderate aerobic capacity. These are your speed endurance type of fibres, your 400, your 800, probably even your 1500 metres. Now, importantly, you'll see when I show you quickly the exam questions that a lot of our games, as we've already established, require your muscles to work in different ways. You need to jump, you need to throw, you need to have extended sprints, you need to endure a long period of time in your performance. And so you may get an exam question that asks you during a game, give examples of how the 3 different fibres might be used for different aspects of that game. So here's a summary table of those 3 types of muscle fibre. The one thing I didn't mention previously was this bottom row down here. Now, recruitment order is something you definitely need to know. And what that means is, what order are these fibres asked to work by your brain? Your brain sends action potentials down neurons to innovate your fibres. What's the order of recruitment for progressively high intensity work? So if you're working at a low intensity, you would recruit just your type 1 fibres. They're the first to be recruited. If you began to work harder, let's say you cranked up the speed on the treadmill, you would still recruit your slow twitch fibres, but you would also recruit your type 2A fibres to help out. So you can, between them, generate a greater force to make you keep up on the treadmill. If you, again, cranked up the treadmill so that you're going pretty fast, you would add to that. So you'd have your type 1, type 2A, and your type 2X recruited to try to give you maximal force. So the order of recruitment is type 1, type 2A, type 2X. So let me just finish by showing you, I think there's 5 different sorts of exam questions that we've had. Here's an 8 marker, so this would be question 10. A cyclist who recruits different fibres to meet the changing demands of the race. Remember, depending on the demand, one of the fibres will be the dominant fibre that's recruited. And it wants you to analyse this event. It's told you that the demands of the race vary, and you've got to justify your choice of fibres that you talk about. I would recommend that in this example, all 3 would be good to talk about. So here's the mark scheme. Pause the video, have a look. Basically, for the high intensity bits, maybe going up a hill, for the high intensity bits down here, the sprint finish, going up a hill, overtaking somebody, would be your type 2. For the moderate intensity bits, such as a long drag climb, would be your type 2A. For the easygoing, steady state, keep going on the flat, would be your type 1. Here's a different kind of question for 4 marks. Now it's given you 2 activities that are contrasting, a shot put and a 5,000 metre run, which is an endurance event. And it's asking you what fibres would be recruited for each, and it wants you to explain that. So you can imagine it's 2 marks for explaining the fibre and the reason for each of those 2 events. Again, pause the video, have a look, and there's the mark scheme. Here's another one. Explain why 2 different muscle fibres are recruited when playing tennis for 4 marks. So again, the verb is explain, and they want you to talk about 2 fibres, not all 3. You could pick any of the 3 as your 2, as long as you say what fibre and say why, explain why. 2 marks for each choice of muscle fibre. There's the mark scheme. Have a look. It's nice and easy, I think, there. And then last, and I think it's 2 more. Here's one. It's given you slightly different, this one. So it's 4 marks. There's 4 blank boxes in the table. It's given you type 1 fibres have high myoglobin content. And it wants you to answer what are the other two types of fibre, and what's the myoglobin content of each. And there we have it. So you know that type 2A have some, and type 2X have very little because they're anaerobic. Type 2A needs some because they are both anaerobic and both anaerobic and aerobic. Lastly then, here's another sort of one. Different muscle fibres are recruited at different parts of a football game. Analyse how they're used during a game. So again, you will discuss aspects of the football game which recruit type 1, type 2A, type 2X, and give reasons for and discuss why those would be recruited because of how they work.